I never believed in old legends, not until the night I saw La Llorona with my own eyes. Growing up in Mexico, the story was everywhere. They told us that she was the spirit of a woman who had drowned her children in a fit of rage and was cursed to wander the earth, wailing for them. Every child in my town had heard the warning. If you hear her cries, run the other way. If she's close, she sounds far. But if she sounds distant, God help you, she's right behind you. I used to think it was just another folk tale. That changed one fateful night. It was the summer of my 17th year, and my friends dared me to prove my courage. We had spent the evening at Javier's house, drinking cheap beer and telling ghost stories under the dim glow of a single, flickering candle. I boasted that I didn't believe in spirits, that the stories were just tools to scare children. Then, with the smugness of a fool, I accepted their dare to walk alone to the old riverbank past midnight, the very place where La Llorona was said to haunt. I should have known better. The night was thick with the scent of damp earth and stagnant water as I made my way toward the river. The town's streetlights ended long before the dirt path leading to the water, leaving me with only my flashlight and the distant glow of the moon. The air was heavy, too still, as if the night itself was holding its breath. The river was nothing special, just a shallow, sluggish stretch of water, dark as ink under the moon. I kicked at a rock, letting the silence settle around me. It wasn't scary, not really, just lonely. I laughed under my breath, shaking my head. Maybe I'd stay a few more minutes just to prove my point. That was when I heard it. A soft, distant wailing drifted through the trees. My blood turned cold. At first I told myself it was the wind, but there was no wind that night. The air remained still, the trees rigid, their leaves unmoving. The wail came again, closer this time, a sound of sorrow so deep that it made my chest tighten. It was a woman's cry, full of anguish. "Mis hijos, mis hijos." My skin erupted in goosebumps. The voice was near, but it sounded far away. The legend's warning rang in my head. If she sounds distant, she is near. I turned sharply, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. The beam of light trembled as I held it, my fingers slick with sweat. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw her. She stood at the edge of the water, her figure draped in a flowing white gown, long and tattered, as if it had been soaked and left to rot. Her hair hung over her face in wet, tangled strands, but I could see the faint glimmer of her eyes beneath. Empty, hollow. She lifted her head, and the sight of her face made my stomach drop. Her eyes were black pits, endless and consuming. Her mouth hung open unnaturally wide, twisted in agony, her lips cracked and stained with something dark. Her wail rose, piercing and unnatural, a sound that made my ears ring and my knees buckle. Run. My instincts finally kicked in, and I turned to flee. But as I did, the wailing stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the sound. It felt wrong, like the world itself had stopped. Then I heard breathing, right behind me. A slow, ragged breath. Too close, too real. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see her face again. But something, a force beyond my control, made me look. She was there, inches from me. Her hand shot out, cold and wet, gripping my wrist with an unnatural strength. I gasped as ice spread through my veins, numbing my arm. I tried to pull away, but she wouldn't let go. Her lips moved, forming words I could barely understand. Ayúdame, mis hijos. Help me, my children. A flash of images burned into my mind, visions that weren't mine. A woman screaming, holding two small children as the waters swallowed them. her own hands forcing them under, the river turning red. I choked on my own breath, my body seizing with the horror of what I was seeing. Then, just as suddenly, the vision ended. I was back at the riverbank, my knees in the mud, my wrist burning where she had touched me. But she was gone. The silence stretched, and slowly, the sounds of the night returned. The chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves in a gentle breeze that hadn't been there before. I stumbled to my feet and ran, not stopping until I reached the safety of Javier's house, where my friends had long since fallen asleep. I didn't wake them. I sat in the corner, shaking, staring at my wrist. The skin where she had touched me was pale, almost gray, as if the life had been drained from it. I never spoke of that night, not to my friends, not to my family, but I knew deep in my bones that she was real, and that she was still searching for her children. Even now, years later, I hear her wails in my dreams. Sometimes when I wake in the dead of night, the air is thick with the scent of damp earth and stagnant boo. And sometimes, just before the silence swallows the night, I hear the softest whisper, "Mis hijos." I never should have taken that shortcut through the canyon. I knew the stories, had heard the warnings since I was a child. The legend of La Carreta de la Muerte wasn't just an old wives' tale. It was a promise that if you heard the rattling wheels in the night, you were already too late. That evening, the sky had turned a deep shade of crimson, the last rays of sunlight swallowed by dark clouds rolling in from the mountains. I was late getting home, and the only way to make it back before the storm was to cut through the canyon path. A winding, narrow road flanked by jagged cliffs and skeletal trees. The air was unnaturally still as I walked, my footsteps muffled by the dust and gravel. Then I heard it, a distant creak, the unmistakable groan of wooden wheels against stone. My heart stuttered. My mother's voice echoed in my mind. "If you hear the cart, drop to your knees and pray. Do not look, do not move." I wanted to run, but my body refused to obey. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the clatter of skeletal hooves and the eerie wail of the wind. I squeezed my eyes shut and fell to my knees, trembling. The air turned frigid, and I smelled it, decay, thick and suffocating. Then silence. A cold breath ghosted over my neck. I felt the presence behind me, towering and oppressive. The stories said that those who saw La Carreta were doomed, but some fates are worse than death. Against my better judgment, I opened my eyes. The cart stood before me, massive and ancient, its wooden frame blackened with age. Two skeletal horses pawed at the ground, their empty eye sockets burning with an unholy fire. And the driver. A hooded figure loomed atop the seat, draped in rotting robes. His face, or what was left of it, was gaunt, stretched tight over hollow bones. In his skeletal hand, he held the reins and a long, rusted scythe. He raised a bony finger and pointed at me. A wave of darkness crashed over me, and I felt my soul being yanked from my body. I gasped, but no sound came. My vision blurred, my limbs turned to ice. I was no longer standing on the canyon path. I was sitting atop the cart, the reins now clutched in my own hands. The driver was gone, and I understood. The legend was not just about seeing La Carreta de la Muerte. It was about becoming it. And now, I was the one who would ride through the night, collecting the souls of those who dared to listen. I should have never gone to La Laguna Encantada. The elders in our village always warned us about it. They spoke in hushed tones about a woman who drowned herself in its waters centuries ago, and how her spirit still lingered, looking for company in her eternal sorrow. Some called her La Dama de Agua, the Lady of the Water. Others simply refused to speak of her at all. But we were young and foolish. My friends dared me to go, to prove I wasn't afraid of old stories. It was supposed to be just a quick visit, a dip in the water, a laugh at the expense of superstition. I wish I had listened to the warnings. The lake was still that night, its surface like polished obsidian under the moonlight. The forest around it was eerily quiet, as if every creature knew better than to make a sound. My friends stayed back near the trees, snickering and whispering as I stepped into the water. The moment my feet touched the surface, the cold shot through me like ice. It wasn't natural. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, that made your heart stutter. But I couldn't back out now, not with their eyes on me. I took another step, then another. That was when I heard it. A soft, mournful humming. I turned, expecting one of my friends to be messing with me. But they were still on the shore, their laughter gone, their faces pale in the moonlight. The humming grew louder, wrapping around me like a whisper carried by the wind. And then I saw her. She stood at the center of the lake, her dress flowing around her like mist. Her hair clung to her face, slick and dripping, and her eyes were hollow, empty. Black pits that swallowed the moonlight. I tried to move, to run back to shore, but the water clung to me, dragging me down. I opened my mouth to scream, and the lake filled it with a taste of rot and sorrow. I thrashed, but hands, cold, skeletal hands, wrapped around my ankles, pulling me deeper. The last thing I saw before I went under was my friends running, leaving me. I don't know how I survived. I woke up on the shore, coughing up black water, my limbs trembling. My friends never spoke to me about that night. They avoided my gaze, as if afraid of what they might see reflected in my eyes, as if afraid of what followed me back from the lake. I still hear the humming sometimes, just before I fall asleep. And when I look into the mirror, I see wet footprints leading away from my bed. La Dama de Agua let me go once. I don't think she'll do it again.